Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. And what I'm going to show you today is based on how I've done a lot of the heresy painting guides in the past, and we're going to paint space wolves pretty quick. Now this fella here, obviously he is not the most attractive and most perfect looking space wolf you're ever going to see, but he's done. Took me about an hour's worth of actual painting, and the end result is something I'd be quite happy to put on the table. So all of the paints are going to be listed in the description below, and today I'm also going to include down there a list of alternatives for if you want to use the same method to paint your heresy era grey space wolves. But let's get started. Now straight away you'll see this fella is not from one of the new Primaris Space Wolves boxes. He is an old Assault Intercessor that I've slapped some spare Space Wolf bits on. He's just going to help me demonstrate the point. Any little wolf talisman bits, we'll touch on those later, but don't worry too much. The method is going to be the same no matter where your space wolf comes from. And once he's assembled, the first thing to do, of course, is to prime him. I've actually started by priming him black. If you see, tip him all the way up there. And then what I've done is, from above, to spray him with the Army Painter's Wolf Grey, which is a fair bit lighter than Fenris Grey. Sorry, the Fang, it's called. It's lighter than the Fang. And when you're applying it, instead of just holding your spray can over the top and going, you're going to apply it in sweeping motions. It'll give you a much smoother finish, and we'll leave some of that black in the undersides and recesses. Now this is a style choice. Some people don't like that so much. I think it adds a little to what we're going to do. We're looking to paint an army very quickly, and any shortcuts we can take, bonus. Now, the first base coat that we're going to apply, perversely enough, is actually Corax White. Now, folks mention all the time they have problems with this. What I would suggest is you want to chuck an agitator in there, a stainless steel ball bearing or similar, maybe even a spare Space Marine helmet. And what I'm going to use this for is anywhere that's going to have a very bright color on it later. So the red on the shoulder pads or the yellow on the other shoulder pads. You don't need to be too careful going around the icon. We're going to paint the icon black. But yeah, this is going to give us a much better starting point for our bright colors than trying to paint them straight over the wolf gray. Because of that, it doesn't need to be a perfectly smooth finish, although it won't hurt if it is. I'm also going to swap to a small layer brush and do in his eyes. But what I want to do while I've got him here as well is to pop a layer of Corax White straight onto the teeth of what's going to be his Frostblade. Now it is super important, this is with every paint, but particularly with Corax White. When you're applying a layer, if you want to apply a second coat, let the first dry thoroughly, because it will go very grainy and bitty if you try and paint over the top of it where some of it is still wet and some is dry. You're going to lift those dry particles up, smear them around, and it will look terrible. So a little bit of patience will go a long way here. As well, if you have splattered anywhere around the eyes, like I have on his left here, don't do the tidy up yet. We've got a couple of stages that we're going to do first before we break out the wolf grey to tidy. So we have Flash Gets Yellow, and this is a super bright, almost sickly kind of yellow. We're going to apply it over the shoulder pad here. Same rules apply as before. Take your time, and try and keep your brush moving in the same direction to keep this layer nice and smooth. Now this is a lot brighter than I want the finished product to be, but because we're going to shade it with something which is fairly warm by comparison, it's going to dull it down and add a little bit of sort of reddish warmth to this. It'll be quite nice. So there's one coat. Now that there is two coats, I am going to come back and actually give it a third. If you're painting 5 Marines or so at a time, then by the time you finish the 5th guy, you can come back and give it another yellow coat. This is the only stage which is really the slow part. While that one dries though, I'm actually going to apply some red, and I have here Evil Sun Scarlet. Again, this is going to be much brighter than what we want the finished product to be, but we're going to shade it. Now this covers gorgeously over that white, and I will pronounce it as weirdly as I can. What I'm also going to do is to switch to my small brush later on and paint in his eyes with this at the same time. You don't have to. You could use a contrast color over a white, but it's up to you. I've got the paint out and it will save me a couple of seconds on each marine to just paint the eyes in now. Now while those are drying, we'll get a look at this sword. What I've got is Ethermatic Blue, and I usually use this for glowing effects on plasma coils and such like that, but it also works super well for a frosty effect. You'll see this looks quite dark as we apply this coat, but I'll just go straight over the teeth. And once that has thoroughly dried, grab yourself some Praxetti White, or White Scar, it really doesn't matter. And we're just going to lightly dry brush the tips of the teeth again. Now we can start base coating some of the other details. I'm going to use Iron Hand Steel for all of the metallic details, and the reason for this is it's a little bit lighter than Lead Belcher, and when we shade it, we're not going to have to highlight it. Matter of personal taste, of course, you might want to use Lead Belcher instead. But remember, we're looking for fast, fast, fast. What is the quickest way that we can do this without having to come back and do any extra work? Unless we want to. So, little metal bits. Now at this stage, if you have any little furry talismans or capes or what have you that you need to paint, lay down the base coat for that now. And something like Mournfang Brown or any brown will do the job. But most of those tend to be mounted on like little gold talisman bits. So that's what we're going to apply next. And I have here Retributor Armor to do this. Now, it's up to you if you like the gold finish. You may choose instead to use something a little brassier. If you like that, I'd suggest that, what is it? Balthazar Gold is probably your better choice. On the blue armor, I tend to like the warmer gold. I think it adds a little bit. But particularly on the 30k Space Wolves, your Heresy era guys, then the Balthazar Gold, that brassier finish might look nice. It's up to you. And away we go. Any brass or gold or whatever color you're doing it, apply that now. And when it comes to the leather details, I have here Mournfang Brown. Get them in the right angle there. This will probably take a couple of coats to get a nice solid color, but it does still cover very well over this wolf grey. Any little dangly teeth or bone bits, I've got here Morghast Bone. You could go up to Ushabti Bone if you wanted to. That's really up to you. But I like the slightly darker finish that this is going to have. Now this bit will of course depend on the miniature you're painting, but for sword grips and what have you, I quite like using Screamer Pink. You can just use the same leather color that you've been using for the rest of the gear, but having this look a little more, I guess ceremonial might be the word, but it looks a little more interesting on our miniature. And now finally we come to painting in the black bits. Now sometimes I'd recommend, if you're painting the undersuit, to use something like Corvus Black, or German Grey from Vallejo. But in order to save time and save yourself a paint, just paint it in black. So I'm using, this is actually black from Vallejo. And the reason why I'm using this rather than a Baden Black is just the coverage is much better. So I'm going to apply this, first of all, using my medium layer brush to the suit and any weapons. And then swap to a small layer brush, and we're going to start carefully painting in the edges of the icon. So this is mostly approaching from the sides and just dibbling up close to it. Now, once I've finished with this, what I'm going to do is try and get the shoulder pad sort of straight on to your edge. It's more difficult with the sword in the way than it needs to be. What we'll do is start from the tip of our pointed edges and just draw back fairly roughly where you want the outline of the jagged, what do you call it, chapter marking or company badge or whatever it is. Then what you can start doing, and then, like I said, this will be easier when you've not got a big honking sword or a camera in the way, but you can start sharpening these up and filling them out as you go. Easy peasy. I tell you what, whether or not that is accurate it changes so much depending on what angle you're looking at it from, so I'm just not going to look at it very closely. If you are doing this yourself, you'll have time to make that look a little nicer than I have. Now finally, I've got wolf grey from the pot, and I'm going to do any last minute tidy up that I need to. So finding little blips and splashes of colour, just go over those with your wolf grey. So you can tidy up around the eyes, for example, like I mentioned earlier. Now once you've done that tidy up, you can touch in any other colours that you need to. What we're going to do now is shade the entire miniature. And what I've got here, this is one of my little pots of mixed up marine juice. This is equal parts Lahmian medium, Nuln oil, and Reichland flesh shade. And this will work with the new shades as well. The kicker is the Lahmian medium, which changes up how they flow. So what I'm going to do, I've given this a good shake, and we're going to apply this liberally over the entire miniature. I'll start with this pack. And yeah, the important part about using this versus something like Agrex Earthshade or similar is that this will flow into the recesses quite nicely. And despite being dark, it's got a little bit of that warmth from the Reichland flesh shade in it. So, like I mentioned earlier with the yellow, that's what's going to help us dull that down a little bit and not look quite so vibrant. So, over everything, take your time, make sure that you are getting it into all of the recesses. I'm now going to drench this marine in marine juice. Just try and avoid the, the frost blade, because I don't really want to change the color on that. Then, as if by magic, you'll have something that looks like this, and that's not too bad to my eyes. In particular, I really like how over the Army Painter primers, it has this nice, smooth, modulated look to the armor. If there's any areas that you do want to add a little bit more depth, particularly like places up on the helmet, what you can do would be to come back with a smaller brush and just paint some of the mix into that recess, but I don't think it's really going to be necessary. What I am going to do though is a little bit of damage, because it's always fun, and I think it quite suits this particular style. So what I've got is a little bit of packing foam, and this pair of tweezers is really handy. It pinches shut when I'm not squeezing it, which makes it really good for my damage brush that we've made. This packing foam is just folded over a couple of times, and it's going to work perfectly for our brush. I'm going to get some Rhinox hide onto my little diblet, and then sort of dab most of it off onto a bit of kitchen towel or some paper. And then, very lightly at first, I'm going to pick edges of the armor where it's likely that this marine would have caught a little bit of damage. So knuckles is always a good spot, around his gorget, the front of the helmet, either left or the right side, up to you. Looks like he's dinged his head. It's important that you don't go absolutely bonkers with this, because you will very quickly just turn him brown. So little dibs and dabs, particularly concentrating on areas that are likely to catch a bit of action. As well as being really easy, that's also a lot of fun to do. What I've got now is one of my scrabbly, horrible old brushes and some Fenrisian grey. And what we're going to do is pretty much the same thing again. Dab most of it off onto a bit of kitchen towel, and then very lightly just dab along the edges of some of these areas to make it look a little more three-dimensional. You can do this with a regular detail brush if you fancy, but a slightly rougher edge is going to look a little bit more realistic. Well, realistic as much as our walking angry tank man will ever look realistic. Now that is a step which likewise you can very quickly go overboard on, but I tend to like the look because if you let your paint run out on your brush and spend a little bit of time sort of flicking along edges where you haven't done the battle damage, you'll still get a little bit of extra highlighting out of the mix. So what I'm going to do now is, well, take them outside and hit them with a matte varnish. I'm going to use a Munitorum varnish spray. And from here, I mean, you could highlight the gold, you could do all sorts of stuff to them. But for the purposes of getting a painted Space Wolf on the table as quickly as possible, I think it's up to you whether or not you want to go that little bit further. I'll pop a quick base on him as well, and let's get a look at what he looks like when he's all finished. And there at last, our Space Wolf is complete. Now, like I said, there's plenty more that you could do from here. If you do pick anything, I would suggest that highlighting the gold and probably the leather would be the easiest parts to do, and they're going to add quite a bit to the miniature. but I think for sheer speed versus result, this is a pretty good method. Certainly how I've painted a ton of similar marines. My Death Guard, for example, they were pretty quick. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.